The following serial killers have at least 6 or 7 confirmed murders. Douglas Clark and Carol M. Bundy, aka the Sunset Strip Killers. I don't have much about the background of these two individuals. Douglas Clark's father was a naval officer, and at one point Clark enlisted with the United States Air Force, but left. After a string of jobs which he was unable to hold down, he met Carol Bundy, no relation, at a local pub. Carol had a very rough childhood. Both parents were alcoholics, and after her mum died, her father sexually abused her and later put her in foster homes. She would be married 3 times before meeting Clark. Carol and Doug would become a depraved serial killer couple like Hindley and Brady before them. Bundy even secured the trust of a young girl who was subsequently photographed and I think even raped. Clark then raped and killed 2 teenagers on June 1980 and engaged in necrophilia. Carol Bundy knew about this and even called the police, but she didn't give any information. 3 more victims followed, 2 sex workers and a runaway. One of the sex workers had their head removed and it was used sexually by Clark. Bundy even put makeup on the head. Bundy had a more active role in silencing an ex-boyfriend whom she foolishly confided in, stabbing him to death and decapitating him. She eventually buckled and turned herself in before his body was found. Clark wound up being his own defense counsel, as Alcala and Ted Bundy had been, and tried to blame Carol, but it didn't work. And it was in stark contrast to his previous promise that he would take the blame if they were ever caught. Clark had been convicted for a 6th murder, but the details are suspicious and the case is a mess. Apparently documents were misplaced and evidence was ruled irrelevant. It's yet something else we'll never know for sure. Ultimately, Carol Bundy got life, Clark got death, but she has since died and he is still alive.
You're scared, you think your lover might be the serial killer.
David Berkowitz, aka Son of Sam. David Berkowitz is one of the most notorious serial killers of the 20th century, and I can't really see why. There are many with higher kill counts, darker crimes, and more interesting minds and motives than him. The Big Four deserve their status as the most notorious, but Berkowitz is always mentioned in top 10 lists at least. The media really blew him up with commercial interests soon following. This resulted in new laws called Son of Sam laws, preventing criminals from profiting from their crimes. Berkowitz claimed insanity, saying his neighbour's dog ordered him to kill. This was a complete fabrication in order to paint himself as schizophrenic, but it sold a lot of papers before the truth was revealed. In the introduction I talked about an interesting serial killer versus an interesting headline, and this is the sort of thing I was alluding to. But this isn't the only reason. He lied about being part of a cult that committed some of the murders as well, selling more stories to the cynical press. And then I'm reminded of Marilyn Manson and the Spooky Kids, a heavy metal group where the members had portmanteau stage names of an American beauty and an American killer. Besides the frontman, we had Olivia Newton-Bundy, Zaza Speck, Gidget Gein, Madonna Wayne Gacy, Sarah Lee Lucas, Twiggy Ramirez, and founder Daisy Berkowitz. I think the stage names contributed to fans researching these figures, myself included. These are well-known killers, and their notoriety was further perpetuated. Berkowitz used a .44 revolver to kill people at a distance. He never even touched his victims, much less raped or tortured them. Murder is still murder, but the case lacks a sense of horror until he started taunting the police. He called himself Son of Sam in letters to authorities and tried to establish a new motive. The motive previously for his crimes was speculated to be sexual frustration, with some commentators claiming the large .44 caliber was a metaphorical penis. I think this is actually quite likely. If sexual frustration was a clear motive, it would make Berkowitz a sort of proto-incel, but maybe I'm being disingenuous in my analysis. Berkowitz was adopted as a child. I get the impression his adoptive parents were kind to their son, but circumstance really attacked them. When he was 7, he was hit by a car and sustained a head injury. A few years later, he witnessed another car accident in which a few people were killed. He was bit by a dog, he ran into a wall, and was a bully and was bullied. He also thought his birth mother had died giving birth to him, and he felt guilty about this. Then when he found out she was still alive, it was a shock. I'll refer to the experience of finding something significant about your family revelations. Something similar happened to Ted Bundy, who thought his mother was his sister. The adoptive mother died while Berkowitz was an adolescent, and this time of his life is marred with juvenile delinquency. When he later tracked down his birth mother, what he found confused and hurt him. She had rejected him. He was also a prolific arsonist who had previously tortured small animals, and after leaving school he enlisted in the United States Army and was later honourably discharged. Ultimately, in 8 separate attacks around New York in the mid-70s, mostly against young couples sitting in their car, 6 were killed and 7 were wounded, some seriously, resulting in a lost eye or paraplegia. An additional 2 were wounded due to some stabbings in the earlier years. The Alaskan serial killer James Dale Ritchie, who killed 5 in 2015, operated in a similar manner to Berkowitz, and perhaps I should study him sometime. Good police work caught the son of Sam, and they tested his IQ to see he scored around 115, an above average score. Berkowitz was similar to spree killers in that he was sexually frustrated and wanted revenge on the world. His revenge was just more targeted. I think what frightened people and contributed to his infamy was the idea that he could strike anyone anywhere, and there'd be no protection.
As an inmate, I'm not allowed to reach out to the victims of my crimes.
Richard Trenton Chase, aka the Vampire of Sacramento. When we use words like crazy or insane, it's meaningless. The terms have legal and medical definitions, and the layman is ignorant of both. Even if I could use them, I have no assurance anyone would understand. But when I say Richard Chase is probably the craziest and most insane killer in this project, I hope it means something. It still feels distasteful for someone like me to say that, and as worthless as saying evil or sick. I've no relevant qualifications, but I try to be less judgmental than some true crime ghoul. And yet, when I read about Richard Chase, my ignorance is glaring. Unlike with Son of Sam, this is our first true look at paranoid schizophrenia. This is a brain disorder that results in psychosis, but I know less about this than my surface level knowledge of psychopathy or narcissism. It is clear that Chase struggled with schizophrenia hard. He was a severe hypochondriac who held a number of strange views and paranoid delusions. He abused alcohol and drugs, and he captured and killed small animals and ate the raw remains. He did this under the impression that it would stop his heart from shrinking. He was institutionalized, and during this time he would inject rabbit's blood into his veins, capture and drink the blood of birds, and even extracted blood from therapy dogs with stolen syringes. He was diagnosed, placed on medication, and released. I don't know how fair it is to blame the mental health professionals who deemed him safe for society, but I do know it was grossly negligent of his mother to wean Chase off his medication. A year or so later he was found in a local park, covered in cow's blood. It boggles the mind how he wasn't considered more of a threat. At the mental institution he was even named Dracula, and when his crime spree occurred he got the title Vampire of Sacramento, which is also possibly the coolest name we've had so far, and I don't know how I feel about serial killers having glamorizing names like that. In late 1977, Chase committed his first murder by shooting a man in a drive-by style attack. Chase then tried his hand at burglary. He wouldn't enter if the door was locked, claiming he was unwelcome and further driving home the vampire angle. But when the more carefree homeowners left their doors unlocked, he entered. He would steal things and sometimes defecate on the bed. After breaking into one house, he shot a pregnant woman to death, sodomized her body, ate her nipple, mutilated her corpse with a butcher's knife, removed some organs, drank her blood, and stuffed dog feces from the yard into her mouth. In one victim, Chase has expressed his mind, and it's like nothing we've seen thus far. Necrophilia, cannibalism, madness. A few short days later, a more terrible crime occurred. A killing spree. He shot a man and a woman to death, then killed the woman's 6-year-old son, and then kidnapped their younger son. He also cannibalized the woman and committed necrophilia once again. A neighbour alerted the police, who tracked him down. Chase's flat was beyond filthy. I've only lightly talked about the lair of a serial killer and how it reflects them, but in this case, the apartment was pure chaos, with animal blood everywhere. When later they arrested Chase, they found the decapitated body of the infant. Chase was found guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. His IQ was found to be in the 90s, so slightly below average. He gave a series of interviews with Robert Ressler, who I've mentioned before and I consider him a hero. Chase believed Nazis and UFOs were responsible for the crimes, and he was acting in self-defense, eerily claiming that anyone else would have done the same. Chase also gave Ressler his macaroni and cheese he'd been keeping in his pockets. Chase believed the prison guards were in league with the Nazis and trying to poison him. Ultimately, Chase ended his own life via overdose of medication. Paranoid schizophrenia will come up a handful of times, but at this juncture it would be remiss not to mention Ed Gein. He also suffered from this condition, killed at least 2, made little effort to cover his tracks, and was a prolific grave robber. He made lampshades and belts from human skin, and was trying to make a bodysuit of his mother. Like with Chase, I don't know what was going on in Gein's deeply disturbed mind, but if there's ever a realm for criminal insanity, this must surely be it. There is also the possibility that Chase was both an arsonist and a bedwetter as a child, and that he was impotent, but I can't find strong verification for those. Additionally, alongside showing he had all 3 features of the McDonald triad, it said his mother sexually abused him as well, and that he even tore apart a cat in front of her, but again, it's pure conjecture. John Haigh, aka the Acid Bath Murderer. We've gone from killers that made no attempt to cover their tracks, to a killer who went to great lengths to cover his. After shooting or bludgeoning his victims to death, Haigh would dissolve the bodies in sulfuric acid to dispose of any forensic evidence, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I didn't find much in the way of trauma history, but it said Haigh was plagued with religious nightmares as a child. Further, in adulthood we see evidence of antisocial behaviour where he stole cash while working in an insurance and advertising firm, and was later imprisoned for fraud. His family disowned him after that, and fraud would characterise his life going forward. About a year after getting out of prison for the umpteenth time, the Second World War was underway. Haigh killed and dissolved his former boss, William McSwan. He sent fake letters to McSwan's parents, and when they got too suspicious, he simply killed them in the same way. I get the impression these kills were partially to fund Chase's gambling problem. He stole his victims' pensions, sold their property, and gambled it all away. A few years later he killed another couple and did the same thing. He then killed a wealthy widow and dissolved her as well. The picture I'm getting of Haigh is clear. He's organised, goal-orientated, greedy and ruthless. His murders weren't influenced by sexual sadism, but rather money. He was a callous, Factor 1 psychopath. Fortunately, the detectives were getting suspicious and searched his workshop. Out back they found some gloop of human remains, as well as some items that didn't dissolve in the acid. Haigh pretended to be insane, failed, and was sentenced to death by hanging. But one mental professional claimed something akin to the 1940s equivalent of paranoid personality disorder, which showed up with Kuklinski as well. There is also the issue that Haigh confessed to 9 murders, leaving 3 unsolved. But this may have been part of his insanity show. Haigh was a conman, pure and simple. He was a pathological liar, obsessed with money, and besides, his body disposal method is quite boring by true crime standards. Terence Rassmussen, aka the Chameleon Killer. Rassmussen is another entry where I know little about his background, trauma history, mental health and personality. It is known he enlisted with the United States Navy from 1961 to 1967. Perhaps it was this experience that inspired him to travel around to commit his crimes. The actual timeline of criminal events is consequently jumbled and confusing. Rassmussen killed his girlfriend, her children, and his own daughter, and hid their bodies in barrels. He killed at least one more woman with whom he was romantically involved with, and is suspected of others. This is very unusual because serial killers don't often have a relationship with their victims. This makes him the first Bluebeard-style serial killer in the project, the masculine equivalent to the Black Widow. I think all of his victims were killed by blunt force trauma. Rassmussen had 6 confirmed victims, but there are definitely more, and Rassmussen was implicated in several disappearance cases. He was also active for a long period of time, around 24 years, and he got away with his crimes and went by several aliases: Bob Evans, Curtis Kimball, Gordon Jensen, Larry Vanner, and Jerry Mockerman. This led to his nickname as the Chameleon Killer. The murders he's considered responsible for, via DNA evidence, are the Bear Brook murders, but Rassmussen died in late 2010 before charges could be made. It seems likely he was a domestic abuser while still alive, and one source says he molested the young girls under his care, but I don't know that one for sure. This case doesn't even have a Murderpedia article.
I don't chase younger women. It's just something that happened.
Otis Toole and Henry Lee Lucas. I've been dreading covering these two. I'm not even sure where to start. I want to be as accurate as possible, but it seems every conceivable force is making this case a huge mess. Ultimately, Otis Toole was convicted of 6 murders, and Henry Lee Lucas of 11, but it seems likely Lucas only killed 3 people, thus it is Toole who sets them at this point in the project. Toole's father was an alcoholic, his mother was abusive and would even dress Toole like a girl and call him Susan. He claimed he was sexually abused during this time. Toole was an arsonist, and it's been suggested he was afflicted with pyrophilia, a sexual attraction to fire, and when later incarcerated he was diagnosed with ASPD. Both of Lucas's parents were alcoholics, his father brewed his own booze, and Lucas lost an eye aged 10 when fighting with his brother, and later on he was beaten by his mother so badly he wound up in a coma for 3 days. This suggests head trauma. His mother was also a prostitute who'd make him watch her have sex and would dress Lucas like a girl. This makes me wonder if Toole and Lucas shared stories or embellished with each other, or maybe even bonded over trauma so similar. It seems so unlikely to me that their 2 trauma histories would align so strongly, and it's speculated that Lucas was pimped out to men and women. Lucas was later imprisoned for burglary, escaped, and then recaptured. Then Lucas murdered his abusive mother in 1960 and was imprisoned and released again due to overcrowding. Lucas tried kidnapping young girls and allegedly sexually abused his stepdaughter. There may have been a second stepdaughter who he also abused, but I can't verify that. Now, Toole and Lucas would cross paths. Toole only had an IQ of 75, making him one of the least intelligent killers in the project. And if Lucas's score of 85 to 89 is to be believed, he's also at the shallow end. Some sources switch the IQs. I don't know which is true. The two met while homeless in a soup kitchen, and some sources say they started a relationship together. Other sources say Lucas started a relationship with Frida Becky Powell, Toole's niece, who was about 10 years old. Lucas may well have killed her years later, and an elderly woman called Kate Rich, who they worked for. Ultimately, Lucas confessed to over 500 murders, some solo, some with Toole, and these murders would have been within the same few years. This would make them the most prolific and brilliant serial killers ever. I have my doubts. Lucas recanted many of these confessions, and even recanted confessions of the murders he probably did commit. He was ultimately convicted for 11 murders, so he might be lower on this list, but what is known is that Toole once barricaded an old man in the boarding house and then set fire to the property. The old man obviously died. Toole also strangled a woman to death and was later found guilty of 4 more murders. It isn't clear to me what involvement Lucas had. Toole was also implied to be involved in the murder of Adam Walsh, and this would make his body count 7. Toole said he decapitated Walsh with a machete, kept the head, forgot about the head, and then threw it into a canal. I don't know what to make of most of this. Lucas was allegedly diagnosed with schizophrenia, but my confidence in anyone involved in the case has been reduced to 0. It's also said he was a necrophiliac. Lucas even allegedly claimed to have killed Jimmy Hoffa. I don't know what Richard Klukinski thought of that. I don't mean to be flippant in this project, but what good are clowns if they're not laughed at? This nonsensical hot mess of a case reflects very poorly on the Texas Rangers who interrogated Lucas. They didn't record Lucas's confessions, they gave him access to the files, they practically bribed him into confessing. And why not? Lucas had nothing by that point. This, combined with dozens of irresponsible documentaries and commentators, leaves me feeling empty. But the thought of the police knowingly getting false confessions and consequently letting the real killers go free is far more upsetting than these two jokers.
Because I had you thought I could slap your teeth out, couldn't I, slut?
Robert Pickton. The first Canadian serial killer of the project was convicted of 6 kills on his farm. He likely killed many more, but the bodies were never found because they were fed to the farm's pigs. Pickton inherited the farm from his parents, who were both abusive, and there's a particularly mean story of them slaughtering one of his pet calves as a child. At the farm there was a space for wild parties that was frequented by Hell's Angels and various sex workers. It was here that many women met their deaths. Pickton targeted prostitutes. He used syringes full of antifreeze to kill the women, often after raping them. There were multiple chances to stop Pickton earlier, but the case was ignored. When the farm was eventually searched, they found a lot of forensic evidence and Pickton was arrested. His brother, David Pickton, was also implicated in the crimes and had a history of sexual assault, but no charges were filed against him. Pickton confessed to an undercover cop to 49 murders while in custody, and the forensic evidence on the farm would connect him to more than just 6 disappearances. But only for those 6 was he convicted. For reasons I don't understand, the second half of the trial dealing with the deaths of 20 women was discontinued. Pickton's motives and mental health elude me, but I've heard his IQ is 86, also putting him at the below average end of intelligence. It's frustrating that a man who's very likely Canada's most prolific serial killer is this far up the list, being the first one I've covered, and I highly doubt he acted alone.
But so many people coming out of my face, I don't know.
Aileen Wuornos. The second female serial killer of the project is one that conforms to the tropes of serial killers more directly than the first, and perhaps any other female serial killer. Wuornos shot and killed 7 men in Florida and took items from the victims, and was eventually convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death. Looking at the trauma histories of serial killers is especially depressing. Admittedly, what I find most depressing is the ones that had an average or even decent experience growing up, thus making their future crimes all the more baffling. But those who did have a terrible time allows me to at least partially understand and not excuse why they did what they did. Panzram, Toole and Lucas are so far the killers with the saddest backstories, if they are true. But now I've reached one of the saddest cases in true crime history. Eileen's mother, Diane, was only 16 when she gave birth to Aileen, and only 15 giving birth to Eileen's older brother Keith. Aileen never met her father, as he was imprisoned and later convicted of raping a 7-year-old girl and hung himself in prison. He suffered from schizophrenia. Diane would abandon the children. Keith and Aileen were taken in by the material grandparents, both of whom were alcoholics. Until the age of 11, Aileen believed her grandparents were her parents, in another instance of what I call family revelations. The grandfather would repeatedly beat the children, and Aileen claimed her grandfather sexually abused her. She demonstrated a sign of abuse by engaging in sexual acts as young as 11 with other children in her school for loose change, food, and cigarettes. There had also been sexual relations between her and her brother, but this isn't verified. She was completely isolated at school with no friends. Aileen fell pregnant by a friend of her grandfather who raped her at age 14. She may have been impregnated by her grandfather or even Keith, but it isn't clear which. The baby was given up for adoption. The grandmother died of alcoholism. Aileen completely dropped out of school. She was thrown out of the house by her grandfather and was now homeless, supporting herself through prostitution. As a teenager, she was constantly in trouble with the law: theft, intoxication, brawling, etc. She shot at a moving car, married and divorced a rich old man. She was arrested multiple times, and a year or so later her brother Keith died. Between the ages of 14 and 22, she attempted suicide 6 times, and as a prostitute she would sometimes service 25 men a day, and I'm sure she suffered from alcoholism. It's absolutely dizzying how horrible her life was. Aileen started a romantic relationship with another woman, Tyra Moore, and soon she'd commit her murders. Aileen killed men who picked her up and killed them away from her home. She also used a gun. This behaviour is more like male serial killers than the feminine baby farmers and poisoners we'll explore later. She also stole money and belongings from her victims. Tyra was involved in extracting the confession from Aileen. Aileen was later diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, and her IQ was measured at 85, and she scored 32 out of 40 on the psychopathy checklist. I'm reminded of Lisa Montgomery's trauma history, and the person that resulted from these intense negative experiences. The difference was temperament. Aileen was extroverted and very aggressive, and her mistreatment resulted in 7 people dead. It didn't have to be this way, but her story isn't that uncommon. Let's just hope this kind of female true crime tale stays uncommon.
As they said, they had it right. A serial killer.
Harrison Graham. The black serial killer is a strange phenomenon for me. One of my earliest delves into serial killers was via the film Copycat. I loved Sigourney Weaver then, and I do now, but the film did contain that famous line.
9 out of 10 serial killers are white males, aged 20 to 35.
And without much internet back then, I couldn't name a single black serial killer for years. Harrison Graham is the first in this project, and he committed his crimes in the 80s. As a child, it was clear Graham was suffering from an undisclosed mental or intellectual disability. It's been speculated that it was autism spectrum disorder, but I can't be sure. After growing up, Graham moved out of his parents' house and got involved in drugs, his own domicile being a place to buy and sell drugs, but he was never violent. But after a foul odour came from the house, he was forced to reveal his premises to his landlord. Graham fled with some belongings before the truth was revealed. The drug den had become a grisly sight, garbage and mess all over, and the bodies of 7 dead women were found, and he quite literally had skeletons in the wardrobe. They had been strangled to death. On the run, he was nearly apprehended a few times before his mother convinced him to turn himself in. The trial was very quick, and he admitted his guilt, narrowly avoiding a death sentence. He may well have been unable to tell the difference between right and wrong. There's no evidence that Graham was a necrophiliac, but he did live less than a mile away from Gary Heidnick, who I've talked about before. There is speculation that Graham suffered from dissociative identity disorder, but again I can't be sure. When he was arrested, the belongings he had on him were confiscated, including a Cookie Monster doll. It's possible one of Graham's alters was a little boy. Once the trial was over, he requested this doll back. It's unclear if this request was upheld. Ivan Milat, aka the Backpack Killer. Giving the United States a break, we have our first entry from Australia. The 5th child of 14 children, Milat's childhood was characterised by chaos and law enforcement, and a lot of juvenile delinquency defined him and his brothers. I can't imagine this was a good environment to grow up in, but I can't find any specifics. He was in and out of prison for various thefts, and later was imprisoned for abduction and rape. While awaiting trial, he fled to New Zealand, and upon returning back, the case was dropped. He was married for a time, but his wife left, citing domestic abuse. Milat also had affairs with at least 2 of his brother's wives. In the early 90s, Milat started his murders, killing backpacking tourists who wanted to hitchhike. Most were from Germany, some from England, and some were native. There is evidence that the victims had been tortured before death, and it's worth noting that he often attacked pairs of victims, which reminds me of Berkowitz. There is also some suggestion that both men and women had experienced sexual assault. Milat would cut their spine, leaving them paralysed, which is a terrifying thought. One person, Paul Onions from the UK, was able to escape Milat, and he was vital in Milat's eventual capture and imprisonment. It seems to me that if you want to survive a serial killer, it's much better to fight in the early part of your abduction. Risk injury or even death is better than almost certain and excruciating death. Onions came down with PTSD as a result, and only by chance did he see the story of a loose serial killer on the news. He would have had to contact the embassy and really make an effort to get his tip heard and his story told. I'm happy to call Paul Onions a hero of the case, I really mean that. Milat was sentenced to life in prison. While in prison, Milat committed a number of bizarre and suicidal actions involving a Pika-like demonstration, a hunger strike for a PlayStation, and cutting off his own finger. He died in prison with an unknown number of further victims. Guy Georges, aka the Beast of Bastille. Our first entry from France is also a torturer and serial rapist. George's mother was French and his father was a black American who was also a soldier. The father left the family and later the mother also abandoned Guy, putting him up for adoption. He had a criminal past involving knife crime. Ultimately, Guy Georges broke into the flats and raped and slit the throats of 7 women in the 90s and attacked and or raped maybe a dozen more. What's more, if he was symbolically attacking and killing his white mother, it shows in that I think all of his victims were white. I'm having some difficulty confirming it, but it also seems like George suffered from narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. From what I understand, his adopted parents were good to him, just like Berkowitz's, but this didn't stop him hunting and killing small animals. I think he used the knife then, as he did with his murder spree. The correct pronunciation of his name is Guy Georges. Apologies for incorrect pronunciations here and elsewhere. His criminal past also involved a repeated history of rape, culminating in an eventual 6-year sentence before his main crimes. He was active for 7 years, 1 year for each victim. He was a stalker and hunter. DNA eventually helped catch him, but it took a while due to restrictions on DNA at the time. Kenneth Erskine, aka the Stockwell Strangler. As a child, Erskine was abandoned by his parents. As a youth, he tried to drown his peers, and as an adult he was homeless. He developed his burglary skills, and eventually strangled 7 elderly people to death, after raping most of them, both men and women. He was apprehended soon enough, and at his trial he was caught masturbating. He was deemed mentally ill and wound up at Broadmoor Hospital, and is still alive to this day. He suffers from schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder, and allegedly only has an IQ of 67, a mental age of 11 and the lowest so far. 7 kills in the space of 4 months might be the bloodiest yet, and he may have killed more, but his murder convictions have since been reduced to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. It's chilling to think he might be released. And so ends the second part of the 100 Serial Killers project. It really dawns on me how much of a waste of time it is to condemn or swear at each killer. It's useless, but we must go on.